He wants to know, I think, whether Europe is really going to rearm and whether Russia is going to have to now face Europe as a sort of significant factor on the continent, and one that can project not just soft power and economic power, as Europe has done successfully for decades, but can really amass hard power and indeed threaten to use it.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are talking to the head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre, a London-based think tank studying Russia. John Lough spent 7 years with NATO and was the first representative of the alliance to be based in Moscow. And he joins us now. John, welcome to Frontline. It's great to see you. Lots to talk about today, but can we just start with an item that's in the news very much so? And this is the apparent assassination of a man who was a former aide to the former Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych, Andre Pnov, in Madrid. What do you know about this, and what insight can you give us into this man?
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation to join the programme. I was very surprised to read about the death of Andre Pnov in Madrid, victim of an assassination, it appears. Pnov was a controversial figure in Ukraine. He is believed to have wielded in recent years great influence over the judiciary in Ukraine. And he, of course, was perceived as a holdover from the days of Viktor Yanukovych, who was removed from power in 2014. This is the so-called Euromaidan revolution. And Pnov was the man who configured a lot of the legislation that allowed the Yanukovych regime, a very corrupt regime, to flourish. So the fact that he left left Ukraine after 2014, I believe, moved to Russia for a while. He was able to come back when Zelensky came to power in 2019. And the fact that he was still able to use his networks in the judiciary and to maintain a certain level of influence, it seems, tells us a lot, in fact, about Ukraine at the time, and what President Zelensky believed he could do, which was to improve the governance of Ukraine and particularly make headway in the area of the judiciary and the functioning of the courts, which was frankly really pretty terrible at the time. So some progress has been made since then, but it would appear that Pnov had some serious enemies. I would guess that this was much more to do with a business dispute than probably anything else.
Yeah, and fair to say that he was a very divisive figure, and he actually had to leave Ukraine because it didn't work out for him staying there anyway.
Indeed, I don't know when he most recently left Ukraine, but he defiantly returned, as I recall, in 2019, and made it pretty clear that he was somebody who was well connected, and he was going to hang around, and he was going to try to shape things still, under Zelensky's rule. And given that they had no previous connections that I'm aware of, and that his agenda was really opposed to what Zelensky and his team at the time wanted to achieve, this was a bold and rather surprising move.
John, thanks for updating us on that and giving us your insight. Let's talk now about the talks that have been going on now since at least this 11th of March. Do you think that President Trump's 2-hour telephone conversation with President Putin achieved very much, except to establish that Donald Trump is preparing perhaps to draw back, having said the conditions for a deal can only be negotiated by the warring parties? So basically saying it's up to Putin and Zelensky now. And Putin just seems to be doubling down on his maximalist demands.
Well, it certainly looks that way. And it seems that President Trump is a man in a hurry. He's getting frustrated by the lack of progress, having promised that he would be able to bring this war to a rapid end. He's discovered that reality is a little bit different, and ending wars, and particularly wars of this kind, are so complicated. This is a process that takes a great deal of time, and in fact, maybe even years. So he has achieved something, and that is he has created a situation where the two sides are talking again. And I don't think that should be completely underestimated. My view is that Putin is actually under more pressure than it appears from the outside. The Kremlin presents this narrative that the Russian army is advancing, Ukraine is about to be rolled over, and Russia will achieve its war goals. That really isn't the case. It is, of course, true that the Russian army is advancing, but it's advancing very slowly. Putin, at the same time, can see that there's a possibility that Europe will be able to keep Ukraine armed and perhaps even motivated to continue fighting on the assumption that President Trump doesn't deliver another military aid package for Ukraine. And I think we can pretty much rule that out 100%. There might be some small things the US continues to do, and an important one would be continuing to offer intelligence support to Ukrainian army, but we don't even know if that's going to be provided. In which case, Putin can see an opportunity to move probably further into Ukraine. He can see Ukraine struggling to maintain the level of resistance that it's shown over the past more than 3 years. But it's not going to be a pushover. And he has got a number of pressures on his side. Firstly, the economy can withstand this level of sanctions pressure for probably another several years. But there are other bottlenecks. Defense industry is struggling to produce certain types of equipment that are being wiped out on the battlefield. If Putin were to go deeper into Ukraine, he'd almost certainly need to increase the size of the Russian army. And to do that, he would probably have to mobilize. And he doesn't want to mobilize. The last time he tried a partial mobilization, that was in September 2022, when the Ukrainians were in fact moving forward at some speed. And it really looked as though the Russian army was getting into trouble. He mobilized 300,000 reservists from across Russia, and about 1 million people in response left the country. Some of those later returned because they couldn't settle abroad. But it was a sign that Russian society, while it may not express disagreement with what Putin's doing in Ukraine or the decision to go to war, it certainly wasn't enthusiastic about it. So from what we understand, the Kremlin is really keen to avoid further mobilization. So there are a number of factors here. I mean, not least that the equipment stocks, some equipment stocks in the Russian army are probably going to run low. They've been burning through what was kept from the days of the Soviet Union, the old Soviet army's stocks, which would be simply put into storage. And we're talking about equipment here from, in some cases, from the 70s, 60s, and even 50s that's being used on the battlefield at the moment. And that's not to say that it's useless, but a lot of it is simply being destroyed. And at some point, the Russian army may need to source that equipment from elsewhere, from neighboring Belarus, perhaps from North Korea, perhaps even indeed China. So there are some real challenges there. And I think that Putin probably has an interest in trying to bring this war to an end. So being offered this type of negotiation by Trump, and effectively being told that the United States really doesn't have a dog in this fight anymore, then that opens up real opportunities. So my view is that Putin is not sure of what he can achieve on the battlefield, because this is taking a long time. The Russian army is simply grinding forward, and it does have the strategic advantage just by virtue of numbers, of men and equipment. But it's a slow and painful process. And then, secondly, he's got to think about if he gets into let's put it this way: he can't be sure what he's going to achieve from the diplomatic process, because this again could take a great deal of time, and he's trying to frame that negotiation now by saying, let's talk about how this should look at the end of the day. How are we going to get to a peace agreement? What's it going to require? So he doesn't want to go straight for a ceasefire. He wants to try to get to a peace agreement eventually, or at least tie Ukraine into a negotiation on a peace agreement.
So in the light of everything you've said and those harsh realities that you say that are facing Putin, do you think that when he comes away from those talks from President Trump and says he would consider working on this memorandum on a possible future peace accord? I mean, that has been derided by a lot of commentators, saying he's just playing for more time to try and make more advances on the battlefield deal by still insisting on those maximalist objectives? Or do you actually think then, from what you're saying, that there might be a genuine desire to find a way out of this war?
Well, let's put it this way. The statement, Putin made a very careful statement after the 2-hour phone call with Trump on Monday. And he stood in front of the cameras, and you can just see from the way he was holding his head even that he was thinking really hard. He wasn't reading a script, and he was trying to find a set of words to describe the outcome of this phone call and what the next steps would be. Putin is an extremely experienced negotiator, obviously deeply versed in international affairs. He knows how these things are done. And it was actually, for me, fascinating to watch him speak, because he was really having to work hard to find the right words. And I would say that he formulated it pretty well. But the one really interesting thing he said was that both sides, and we've never heard this before during the war, both sides have to be prepared to make compromises. I'm slightly summarizing what he said. The sentence, that particular sentence, was a little bit more complicated, but that is what it comes down to. Both sides will have to make compromises. So, what are the compromises the Russians are thinking of making? Well, it might be something around territory. It might equally be an acceptance that Ukraine is going to have adequate armed forces that at least give it the impression that it remains a sovereign country, but don't give it the capacity, for example, to reconquer territory. Previously, the Russians have said, we want the complete demilitarization of Ukraine. And Ukraine can't have any relations, with foreign partners. It's going to be an absolutely neutral country in that sense. So there are, I think we face the prospect now of Putin keeping his options open on both fronts, diplomatically and then simply on the battlefield. But for him, I think there's absolutely no contradiction in negotiating and fighting at the same time. Because in his psychology, to gain advantage at the negotiation table, you need to be showing resolve, you need to be making progress in this other domain. So that's what I think we're going to see over the coming weeks, is probably the start of another Russian offensive in Donbass in southeastern Ukraine. And the Russians have been preparing for this for a good while. And it's quite possible that they will take a larger town. They've had their sights on a place called Pokrovsk for several months now, which still hasn't fallen. It's probably largely in ruins, but it's seen as a strategic hub that if the Russian army were to take it, it would put them in a much stronger position to advance further into Ukraine. So I think we're going to see this sort of curious mixture of things. And it's clear to me that Putin wants Trump to remain involved in this process. Simply not because Trump brings huge added value at this point. After all, he's Trump's played two cards, which was given two cards effectively to Putin by saying, Ukraine is not going to join NATO because the US will stand in the way of that. And then secondly, the US believes that this conflict is going to have to be frozen. So there's no question of Ukraine recovering territory. So for Putin, those are, he's pocketed those concessions, and that makes life a lot easier for him. But at the end of the day, he wants to, I think, be able to rebuild a relationship with the United States. Trump is keen on doing this. And in Trump's view, this is all about business and everybody becomes wealthy in the process. And for Putin, it's in fact about reasserting Russia's influence in the world and pushing back that Western influence. So global affairs are simply not going to be dictated by Western countries, by the US and its allies. So if Trump gets frustrated with Putin and walks away, then many of those opportunities, perhaps, there's commercial opportunities, the negotiation around global governance, that maybe simply won't take place because Trump's attention is elsewhere. So I think he has to keep Trump in the game. And he's trying to do that. And the signal he was sending after that negotiation, that carefully formulated statement, to me, that was all evidence of the game that he's playing. keep the Americans on board because they're useful at the moment.
So, what do you expect President Putin's next move to be to keep Donald Trump from walking away beyond what you just said?
I think we'll see some movement on this memorandum that Putin has proposed negotiating with the Ukrainians. We'll see probably a bit more constructive Russian language around that. And the Russians, of course, will be testing at the same time to see, are the Europeans really going to form this, defense alliance that they're talking about, this coalition of the willing to support Ukraine, but more broadly, what is the, assuming that the US, and I think Putin has to assume this, that the US is progressively going to leave Europe, and that NATO will become a different organization because it won't be backed by the US in the same way. But what, in the end of the day, are they going to be dealing with? And this, I think this is vitally important for the phase that will follow the conclusion of any sort of peace agreement. And let's differentiate here between a ceasefire and a peace agreement. A peace agreement is something that will take, I think, a very long time to negotiate and then implement. But a ceasefire is something that, in fact, could come relatively rapidly. But Putin doesn't want to start the ceasefire. He's been down that road before in 2015 after the annexation of Crimea, and he thought that was the vehicle he could use to achieve his goals, and the Ukrainians actually obstructed it because the peace agreements at that time were written so badly. So he's coming at it from the other way. But he wants to know, I think, whether Europe is really going to rearm and whether Russia is going to have to now face Europe as a sort of significant factor on the continent, and one that can project not just soft power and economic power, as Europe has done successfully for decades, but can really amass hard power and indeed threaten to use it. So, for example, the announcement last week that Germany by 2032 might be spending up to 5% of its GDP on defense. This is nothing short of sensational. Given the Germans are probably hovering around 2% at the moment, but this is the biggest economy in Europe, it's the third biggest economy in the world. So, if Germany is going down that road and other countries, follow at least to some degree, then European defense might look very different.
What do you think European defence needs to look like in order for Putin to be prepared to enter that ceasefire? Under what conditions do you think he would want to do so and then progress towards a peace agreement?
Well, there are different timescales here, aren't there? And we don't know how long Putin is thinking he's going to be in power. He's talked about. I watched an interview with him recently where he was saying he thinks about the issue of a successor constantly. So that would suggest that this is very much on his mind, and maybe he thinks it's just he's going to get to the end of the current presidential term and then move on. But I think the challenge for him now is to find a framework where he keeps the Americans in this process. The Europeans accept that Ukraine cannot win this war and Ukraine is not going to be able to recover territory, and that in order to preserve, let's call it rather crudely, rump Ukraine, so what's left of Ukraine, then there's a question around the orientation of Ukraine in terms of its security policy. Okay, they can block the path to NATO, but is that going to mean that Ukraine has to be a neutral country that cannot have, for example, any military relations with its European partners? There can't be any, for example, European forces on its territory, even if they were only for training purposes rather than as any sort of reassurance force that was initially discussed some months ago, including by Prime Minister Starmer. So beyond that, will Russia be comfortable with Ukraine joining the European Union? And let's remember back in 2014, the reason for the annexation of Crimea and the first invasion of Ukraine, when the Russians started these uprisings in Donbass, they were all related to the signing of an association agreement with the European Union. And it was as if the Russians had suddenly woken up and thought, and having been really rather indifferent to Ukraine's relations with the EU, suddenly perceived a strategic threat. So at the moment, they don't appear to be standing in the way of Ukraine's European Union aspirations, perhaps on the assumption that this is not going to happen quickly anyway. It might be something that lasts for decades, given that within the EU itself there is a lack of consensus about Ukraine's possible accession to the Union. So the Russians may just have concluded that's way down the line. So I think in the short term, Putin's going to look to see whether continuing to fight at this level of intensity or in slightly increasing it is really going to change anything in Europe and indeed in relation to the US, as I've said, and whether he can really start to impose a framework on Ukraine that European countries just accept is probably the only way of bringing this war to an end. So we'll see the sort of strategic messaging from the Russian side going into European capitals. We'll see, our media discussion responding to things that the Russians are saying. And they are, let's face it, they are very skilled in this area. And I think over the last probably 20, 30 years, really improved their ability to project their view of the world and what they believe we should be discussing. So it's very much on their messaging that they wish to be discussed on their terms. So we will see, I think, a real sort of uptick of these efforts over the coming months, because let's face it, for Putin, after 3+ years of this war, he thought he was going to be able to bring Ukraine to its knees within a matter of weeks. More than 3 years later, he finds himself still fighting on the ground, controlling about 20% of Ukraine's territory, nothing more, and with a formidable array of sanctions now in place against Russia, more sanctions added this week by both the European Union and the UK, and possibly more meaningful sanctions actually, because they're starting to try to go after Russia's oil revenues, particularly the sale of oil to Asian countries, which has been a big factor in sustaining the Russian economy. So Russia is very isolated at that level from the West. Yes, it's built up its relations with the global South and with reinforced its relations with China in particular. But I'm not sure that really compensates. This is a very unnatural posture for Russia to be so alienated from Europe and so dependent on China at the same time. So for Putin, the balance sheet is not particularly positive at the moment, and I think he wants to shift it quite radically, and I believe bring this war to an end, of course, on his terms.
Yes, of course, on his terms, and there are two sides to this negotiation, of course. And if he offers something which, or says he's prepared to make concessions which are completely unacceptable to Zelensky and to the Ukrainians, then the possibility is that the Europeans, allies, arm Ukraine to the hilt, back Ukraine, and that actually the war continues and Putin doesn't get what he wants anyway.
I think you're right. That is a real danger. But the supposition there is that the Europeans have both the desire and the capability to do that. Because my sense is that talking to people around Europe is that people are getting very tired of this war, and it's costly. And although if you like, the noble aspirations of preserving Ukraine's territorial integrity, they're all there. They're repeatedly voiced that this is unacceptable, that Russia must stop, and we can't run Europe, on this basis. That there's a reason why we have treaties, rules, and values, and all these things. So people understand that, but they see that the difficulty of simply implementing this vision when we are in economic terms, we many countries in Europe are really pretty constrained. Germany is actually here the real outlier because it's managed its public finances in a very different way, and it's a wealthier country than many. But I mean, look at the UK in this respect. We have very limited armed forces, and if we were to try to really put our shoulder behind Ukraine, we would rapidly struggle. And we've given away a lot of equipment to Ukraine, ammunition, all these things. And I'm told that the maximum, let's say we could have a peacekeeping force hypothetically in Ukraine, and this has been talked about. Probably the maximum we could send this maximum size of force would be about 5,000 men, and even then there'd be a question of whether we could equip them. So I think that gives us just an idea of the constraints facing a number of European countries. But indeed, let's say if Putin and Trump effectively agree between them, the outlines of a peace deal for Ukraine, and this is unacceptable to Ukraine and its European partners, then we are in trouble. And one of my concerns, if we consider that scenario, is that it would quickly lead to the unraveling of the NATO relationship between obviously the US and the European partners. In other words, that withdrawal, strategic withdrawal from Europe by the US could be accelerated. And at the moment, in NATO circles, there's a belief that yes, the Americans are going to draw down their forces in Europe. That commitment is changing, but this can be done in a measured, orderly way. Now, we know with President Trump that that's actually rarely the case, that things are orderly or measured. And this may be just the sort of excuse he would be looking for, to say, look, I've already had it. We can't do this. Europeans are, at the end of the day, are just not being reasonable. They don't accept, in his view, that Zelensky has no cards. This game has to come to an end, and we just have to live with the fact that the Russians are bigger, stronger, and want Ukraine more. So what can we do? We just have to surrender Ukraine. That might be the logic, I think, of some people around President Trump in Washington.
And you talk there about your fear about the unraveling of NATO, of the US potentially considering exiting it. What future do you see for NATO without the US involvement? Is that a possibility for it to survive?
Well, I think there's a possibility that firstly, the US may wish to maintain the NATO framework, because it's certainly a useful vehicle for the US to exercise influence both in Europe and beyond. But they would like to do so without having to pay for it to the same extent, and without having to provide an unambiguous security guarantee that effectively the Americans would still be prepared to sacrifice New York for London. That was the old sort of Cold War formula when we were discussing the possibility of nuclear war. But if there is a fundamental rebalancing within NATO, that European countries consistently invest much more in defense, take the burden off the US, that countries understand that the former sort of Cold War commitment of the US to Europe is not there, that in some instances the US might come to Europe's aid, in others it might not, that maybe there is a way of keeping this framework together. And the European members of NATO, I think they very much want this. And of course, one of the ironies is that after 2022, NATO enlarged, with both Finland and Sweden joining NATO, which was an absolutely remarkable outcome. I never thought I would see that when I was a NATO official, that both countries would change, in the case of Sweden, centuries of the security policy. And in the case of Finland, of course, decades, that they should do that really so quickly because of their perception of the threat posed by Russia. So the irony is the alliance has enlarged, and then with President Trump returning to the White House, its whole existence has been called into question. So I don't think that the Russians are at this point certain that NATO is going to disappear. Putin is a strong believer in the existence of the deep state in the US, and may well believe that Trump is a short-term phenomenon. What are we going to be dealing with in 4 years? It may be a very different American leadership, and it may not be as isolationist as the current one.
And just if I could finally ask you, drawing from your experience as the first NATO representative to Moscow between 1995 and 1998, when Boris Yeltsin was president, just wondering if you could sort of reflect upon that time in Moscow back then, the challenges facing NATO then, and how you see it, and what the job would be like being with that kind of role for you today.
Well, that's a very, very interesting question. When I look back to the 90s, in some ways it is with real nostalgia, because Russia was trying to find its feet during this still very chaotic period of the aftermath, the collapse of the Soviet Union. When I showed up in Moscow in the summer of 1995, we still had a really pro-Western foreign minister, who was looking for ways to cooperate with NATO, and there seemed to be so many potential opportunities there for improved interaction, the building of trust. And at the end of the day, the relationship between NATO member states is all based on trust, and they wanted to bring Russia into the tent and just really start doing things together, because when military people and military political advisors, they start working together, they quickly find a common language. And you can start to sort of jettison some of the old stereotypes that, of course, existed on both sides. But that mood changed quite rapidly. Firstly, when NATO lifted the siege of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, so used force to do so. The Russians were already sort of jumping up and down, I remember, and that was in 1995. And then we had the spectre of NATO enlargement. And that really changed the mood and the readiness of the Russians to engage with NATO. So the pro-Western foreign minister was gone. Andrei Kozyrev went, and his successor, Yevgeny Primakov, who was a man from the intelligence world who had really quite old-fashioned views about the intentions of the West towards Russia and Russia's interests. And we quickly started to get into this more, I would say, sort of difficult relationship. And then things really changed in 1999 when NATO intervened in Kosovo. I think that was, in fact, a watershed. And the sort of partnership relations that we've been trying to build up, really suffered at that point. And then, after Putin came to power, I think he was initially quite relaxed about the whole NATO dimension. But as time wore on, he seemed to change his view, and possibly because of his conclusion that Russia needed to be governed in a certain way, and the hyper-centralized state needed to be preserved, and that state, in fact, needed an adversary in order to justify itself, and NATO just became this sort of convenient whipping boy. And that's not to say that NATO always acted in the smartest way. In my view, the 2008 statement, the Bucharest summit, that Georgia and Ukraine would join NATO was a kind of red rag to a bull. Everybody knew that this was something that was never going to happen anytime soon, and certainly not in Putin's lifetime. But it was enough for the Russians to use it as a pretext and then to initially invade Georgia and then subsequently Ukraine.
John, it's been great talking to you. I'd really like to continue this conversation another time, and so much to think about. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.